Hello, and welcome to another set of video game animation analysis episodes. My name is Dan, and today we're going to talk about the animation in Jak and Daxter. But before that, I've got another lesson on the principles of animation for you guys. You may remember that last time when we were playing Shadow of the Colossus, I talked about the first principle, which was timing. Today for Jak and Daxter, we're going to talk about the next principle, which is squash and stretch. Squash and stretch is exactly what it sounds like. It's the squashing and stretching of animated objects to exaggerate motion or to show impact. It helps you to express movement and weight while still preserving an object's volume. It lends an animated object flexibility and a sort of organic softness that keeps it from feeling rigid or stiff. This is the principle of animation that lends itself best to cartoony styles, where the characters are completely malleable and their movement is really exaggerated. Exaggeration of movement is a really big part of animation. In fact, it's one of the principles, and we're going to be talking about it in a later episode, but not today. As with a lot of the animation principles, the easiest way to explain squash and stretch is with a bouncing ball. Imagine you've got a rubber ball bouncing across the floor. As that ball hits the ground, it's going to compress against the hard floor, squashing down into an oval. Then, as the force of the bounce launches it back up into the air, it's going to stretch at first, until settling back into its spherical shape mid-flight. But squash and stretch can be applied to a lot more than that. It's sort of what we do when we jump. We squash down as we bend our legs, and then we stretch out as we leap up into the air, and then we kind of squash again in midair as our feet catch up to us. When a cartoony character moves somewhere super quickly, their whole body will stretch like crazy in that direction. Our facial features can even squash and stretch when we're making changing expressions. The extremity of the squelch may vary, but it can be applied to all kinds of stuff. Now, like I said, squash and stretch is the bread and butter of cartoony animation. The more you apply to the character, the more malleable, squishy, and cartoony they're going to appear. Like, you know those crazy smear frames that you see in screenshots of certain Disney films? That's the Disney animators applying the principle of squash and stretch to exaggerate a quick movement, to make it feel really snappy and appealing to the eye. Aladdin in particular is just loaded with this sort of exaggerated motion. And it may look silly when you're looking at the still individual frames, but when you see that move in motion, it looks awesome. Of course, that sort of squishiness isn't appropriate for every character, especially those that are meant to look more realistic, so it's important to know when to hold back. Now, you won't often see that sort of extreme cartooniness in a lot of video games, as we just don't do super cartoony animation very often. Also, 3D animation has become a lot more common than 2D animation in video games these days, and that sort of cartoony malleability can be a lot harder to achieve in 3D. Like in 2D, if you want to have your character hit this really stretched out, bizarre pose, you just draw them that way, and there, done. But with a 3D model, your ability to contort the character is defined by the skeleton rig inside it, and these sort of specific, bizarre deformations can be really difficult to achieve. But just because we can't contort the character into bizarre shapes doesn't mean we aren't still applying squash and stretch. You don't have to be doing zany, cartoony stuff to use this principle. Even when you're being subtle with it, it's still a really good tool to use. A little bit of squash and stretch on a realistic character can make them feel just a little softer, a bit more flexible, slightly less plastic and stiff. In those scenarios, you want it to be something that the audience feels rather than notices. So there you go, that is the basics of squash and stretch. If you missed the lesson on the previous principle, timing, you can watch the first Shadow of the Colossus episode and catch up on that there. And on the next game I play in this series, we will move on to the next principle of animation. But for now that we are sort of familiar with squash and stretch, let's start talking about the animation of Jak and Daxter, because it uses squash and stretch quite a bit.
I have spent my life searching for the answers that my father and my father's fathers failed to find.
So, Jak and Daxter is a pretty impressively animated game, especially considering how early in the PlayStation 2's life cycle it came out. If you have seen Jak 2 and Jak 3, Jak and Daxter 3, their naming structure kind of kept changing as they kept making sequels, but if you have seen the later games in the Jak series, you will know that they managed to improve the look of the characters especially quite a bit. But even here in the first game, you can tell that they were already investing a lot of resources into character animation. And even though it's pretty rough and the models are pretty low res in general, I think that effort shows. And I would say Jak and Daxter, on average, is a quite well animated game, but it's one of the games from this era that tends to stick in a lot of game animators' minds because there aren't a lot of examples of super stylized, cartoony, Looney Tunes-esque animation in video games, and this is one of the few, and they did quite a good job on it. Not perfect, of course, I absolutely have some nitpicks, which we'll get to later, but this is still a pretty impressively animated game, and it's just nice seeing a 3D animated game really go for that cartoony, stretchy, exaggerated look. All right, I'm gonna let you guys actually watch the cutscene instead of talking over everything.
Jack, old green stuff told us not to come here.
Continue your search for artifacts and Nico. If the locals possess precursor items, you know what to do.
Deal harshly with anybody who strays from the village. We will attack it in due time.
What are we doing here anyway, Jack? This place gives me the creeps. Huh? Oh, stupid precursor junk. Eek! What is that dark ooze? It sure don't look friendly. The sage yaps on about the precursors that built this place all the time. Where did they go? Why did they build this crud? Now, I like precursor orbs and power cells as much as the next guy. But if you ask me, they must have been real losers. Wow! How did you do that? Jack, I think we're in trouble! Man, that stung! I told you we shouldn't have come here, and you listened! What? Okay. I'm fine.
All right, let me pause things here for a minute. So, as you guys can see, definitely a very cartoony, exaggerated style of animation here. And it's a lot of fun, despite the low-res versions of the models they got. Now, I'm going to play this cutscene here in a minute, and I'm going to not talk during it so you guys can actually focus on it. But my main complaint about the animation in this game is mostly seen in the cutscenes. So we're going to watch this cutscene, and while you're watching, pay attention to the animation and see if there's anything you notice about it that feels off, or like it could be slightly better. And of course, obviously the character models are low res. These are PlayStation 2 models and rigs. There are going to be little imperfections and things that move weird and wrong, just little subtle stuff that just has to do with the technology of the time. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking specifically about their performances they give. See if there's anything specific to their performances that stands out to you as maybe not working so well. All right, here we go.
What in green tarnation do you two want?
I was...
Don't tell me! Instead of heeding my wisdom, the two of you went mucking around in the only place that I told you not to go, Misty Island.
That's right, and then...
And, Daxter, you finally took a much-needed bath, but in a bathtub filled with dark eco.
Look, old man, are you gonna keep yapping, or are you gonna help me out of this mess?
I'm gonna keep yapping, because in my professional opinion, the change is an improvement. And besides, I couldn't help you if I wanted to.
What?
There's only one person who has studied Dark Eco long enough to have a chance at returning you to your previous form. Carl Acheron, the Sage. But he lives far to the north. Far, far to the north. Nobody has spoken to him in ages. I would teleport you there, but I can't do that either. None of the three sages that maintain the other teleporter gates have seen fit to turn their ends on for quite a while. The only other way north is by foot through the Fire Canyon, but its volcanic soil is hot enough to melt precursor metal. You can't just walk through it.
But you could fly over it if you had a zoomer equipped with a heat shield. I just happen to be working on such a thing at this very moment. All I would need is 20 power cells to give it enough energy to withstand the canyon's heat. Isn't that right, Daddy?
Yes, Kira, that might work. But where are a boy and a half going to get 20 power cells?
From the villagers. Most of them have a power cell or two stashed away somewhere. And even if they aren't willing to just give them away, greasing their palms with a few precursor orbs should do the trick. And I bet there are even more of them out in the wilds just waiting for some brave adventurer to find.
Well, we've got the brave adventurer at least.
Brave adventurer? You two couldn't find your way out of the village without training. Before you do anything else, you better go through the warp gate and get some practice on Geyser Rock.
We won't find any more of that dark gooey eco stuff, will we? 'Cause I'd hate to fall in again and turn into you.
Get in there before I turn you both into ferns.
All right, so let's go back to that cutscene, and let's watch it through again, and let's talk about the performances here. Overall, the animation here is pretty nice, especially for this era and this time. I mean, I give Naughty Dog full credit for the fact that they've clearly put a pretty sizable budget into their animation. There's a lot of fully performed cutscene animation that happens in this game, and all of that work really helps to make these characters feel expressive and alive and really just filled with character, and that's great. I think that is great for this game. Speaking just in terms of performance, though, if I were criticizing this the way I would an animated film, and even though I know that video games rarely have the resources or team sizes that a film would, so it's not necessarily a fair comparison, but if we're being nitpicky just for the sake of analyzing animation quality and what can be improved, the biggest problem I have with the cutscene animation in Jak and Daxter is that it is very busy. These characters are moving a lot and gesturing a lot. Like on every single line and every phrase, they have a big, expressive gesture, which it's nice that they're expressive and there's lots of personality to be found there, but because they have so many of these gestures happening in such a short span of time, just back to back to back to back, gesture, 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 pose, gesture, gesture, it makes it difficult for the viewer to take it all in, and that means that the animators aren't really getting maximum impact from any one of those gestures, not as well as they could be. And all of these gestures and all of their acting are at the exact same energy level. It's just frenetic and big and snappy and all over the place. I think they could be getting a much better result by having these characters chill out a little bit. Just a little bit. Because you can still have big cartoony gestures and snappy movement and snappy timing and make it really entertaining. But if you do too much of it just too rapidly altogether, then you actually make it less effective. It gets overwhelming. In some ways, this is kind of an issue with the timing of the animation in a sort of larger macro sense in terms of like the comedic timing and laying out the timing of the beats of the performance and all that. But I think it's probably better described as a staging issue. Staging is a principle we will get to much later, but it basically means presenting things so that they are clear and making sure that the viewer's attention is always drawn to what it should be. And I think that these cutscenes tend to have a lot of staging issues, at least in Jak 1. Something that a lot of young animators tend to fall into just when they're first starting out and learning is that they think they need to create a gesture for every phrase and every line the character says. As an animator, you don't want to animate to the line or the sentence. You want to animate to the character's thought process and what they're thinking. That's how you make them feel like actual living, thinking beings. And it may seem like I'm being a little overly critical about this, but the thing is, I think Naughty Dog felt the same way. Because even if you just look at Jak 2, one game later, the character performances in that game are toned way down.
Today's the big day, Jak. I hope you are prepared for whatever happens.
I think I figured out most of this machine. It interacts somehow with that large precursor ring. I just hope we didn't break anything moving it here to the lab.
Easy for you to say. We did all the heavy lifting.
Daxter, don't touch anything!
You see that? That's way more contained, way less all over the place, and it's actually way more effective because it gives you a chance to actually focus on their eyes a little bit. And having those moments of stillness means that when the characters do make some big, exaggerated cartoony move, it stands out more and you notice it. It creates more contrast.
Okay, I swear, that's the last time I ever touch any stupid precursor crap!
It's that contrast that really lets you get the most out of this cartoony, exaggerated animation. Okay, so now that I've spent a while whining about their cutscenes, let's get to their actual in-game gameplay animation, because a lot of this stuff is awesome. Okay, my favorite thing about the animation in Jak and Daxter is just the general gameplay animations of these two main characters. And there's a lot to dig into, so I'm just going to be running around this area for a little while, just blabbing. The gameplay and just character navigation and combat animation in this game is really good, and I think my favorite thing about it is Daxter in general. The animators at Naughty Dog managed to use Daxter to bring so much personality to even the most basic kinds of animations you can imagine. Every one of those actions that Jak performs, Daxter manages to make 5 times more appealing and entertaining, and I love it. Let's just start with their idle pose. You see, Jak's pose here is fine. I mean, it's nothing special about it. It's kind of neutral and a little blob, but it's fine. It's a perfectly fine pose. But having Daxter sitting perched up there on his head makes it so much more entertaining and brings so much more character to it. You might also notice the... I love it. And they'll do things like that every now and then too while they're standing there, just to keep them alive and bring even more character to it. That's really nice. But yeah, you see how much movement is happening on their clothing and their hair and the ears and just all the loose bits of stuff on them? That serves a couple of purposes. Part of it is that it helps them look a little bit cooler and keeps them feeling alive and not perfectly still or dead while they're just sitting there waiting, but it also helps to separate them from the background a bit, because our eyes are really drawn to movement, and by having the characters still moving a little bit, even when they're still, helps to visually separate them from the background, so that you never have a problem finding where the characters are on screen. And look at their walk and run animations. I mean, Jak's animation looks really nice. He's got some nice arm swing, some nice bounce in his step. I like it. It looks really great. But having Daxter up there perched on his shoulder and bouncing around with every step is really cute and brings way more personality to it. Ooh, and let's talk about some squash and stretch here. Look at Jak's torso as he runs, just kind of down from the belt line up to the shoulders. Notice how much his torso compresses and extends as he runs, and how that compression and extension carries on up through the neck and head to create this really bouncy feeling as he runs around. That is squash and stretch in action happening on the torso right there, and it creates a squash and stretch feeling on the entire body if you look at it. As his foot comes down and he lands, his body kind of squashes down, but as he leaps up, his body stretches out again. It feels really nice and loose and cartoony. I love it. And if you really want to see some squash and stretch in action, let's look at their jumps. This is a really nice cartoony jump, and there's some major squash and stretch happening here, so let's really dig into this. As he begins the jump, look at how far his body stretches in the direction that he's jumping. He's almost gained like 50% additional height here. And Daxter's body's fully extended as well as he tries to hang on and is dragged behind. Then, as Jak reaches the apex of the jump, his feet catch up and his spine bends and his knees come up to his chest and he kind of compresses up in a little ball. But then, as he starts going back down to the ground, he stretches his body out again so that when he hits the ground, he has got plenty of room to compress and absorb the shock of the jump. And Daxter's body, dragging behind, helps to reinforce the arc of the jump too. And on top of that, there's some really nice overlap happening on Jak's arms as he goes. There's a lot of nice stuff happening in this jump. I love the cartooniness of it. Just look at how bouncy that feels. This really makes me wish there were more 3D games that tried to go for that cartoony look, because this just looks so appealing. All right, you want to see some more squash and stretch? Let's look at their attack, because there's a lot of heavy body deformation that happens in that attack. All right, so let's step through it. First, we see Jak coil up, then he stretches way far. Look at that pose. Look at that line of action. Look how stretched out his body is right here. His hair and his legs are dragging behind. His arm is stretched way out behind him, and Daxter is also stretched way far behind. And they really increase the size of his fist during this move so that you can see and really feel just the slam impact of it. And it looks really weird as I frame through it here, like as you can see how just weird and deformed his body gets, but in action it looks pretty darn nice. And the stretch on Daxter really helps to sell this. Look at how far behind he gets dragged. Look at how stretched out his body gets. And then he snaps forward and catches up, and the snap back into position from that stretch almost throws him over Jak's shoulder. Now, despite all of that praise I just laid on this animation, I think this attack also helps to show the technical limitations that Naughty Dog would have run into trying to recreate this cartoony Looney Tunes looking feel. To really stretch and squash these characters as much as they want to would require a lot of bones in each character's rig, and PlayStation 2 era games were pretty limited in the number of bones per character that they could actually manage to calculate without dropping the frame rate like crazy. So they don't have the ability to deform the character as much as I think they would like to. Like, you see how when Daxter's body gets stretched way out with this punching attack, his body gets stretched like crazy, but his head stays in the same round shape as always, which doesn't necessarily ruin the effect, but it does mean that they aren't able to completely imitate the look of what a 2D animator would have done. If a 2D animator were drawing this attack by hand, they would probably have Daxter's head stretched out just like the rest of his body, just making him one really long stretched line. But unfortunately, Naughty Dog's not really able to do that with Daxter's rig here, so they aren't able to perfectly do what they want to achieve. But I think they emulate the cartoony look about as well as you can expect for PS2 hardware. You can see what they're going for, and I think that largely it works. Okay, I'm not going to blab on that long about all of their other attacks and moves, but let me just play through some of the rest of these in slow motion here, and watch how they use squash and stretch in all of these, and watch how they use Daxter's animation to really reinforce and add appeal and entertainment to everything Jak does. It's really successful overall, I think. Okay, so here's a really smart thing they do. When you're controlling Jak and you're having him run forward, if you take your finger off the stick and have him stop running, he doesn't just immediately snap into his idle pose. He first does this transition where he kind of jogs in place for a second and then stops, which is a really smart idea because it helps to keep him alive and in character and really smooths out that transition from running full speed to standing still. That's a smart bit of animation design. Alright, I think I'm going to call it for this episode. Thank you for watching, and I will be back soon with some more Jak and Daxter because there's just a lot of great animation to dig into here, so see you next time.